So, Wi-Fi and children. I have been just shocked at the products that are coming to market. This is a wireless baby diaper. And yet at the same time, so from infancy, right? Children are being marketed to for devices. Parents are being marketed to. And this is just a clip from Market Watch where Madonna says, "I made a mistake when I gave my older children phones when they were 13. It ended my relationship with them, really. Not completely, but it became a very, very big part of their lives." And I think that many parents can attest to that. I certainly can, although my children don't have cell phones, but just to the impact of screens in our life, which I held off for a long time, but I do have two teenagers now. And here's the kind of marketing that we're seeing. Your devices were made for amazing. And what we're not seeing or hearing is that research looking at our youngest users of screens has found delayed speech development, delays in fine motor skills. There's also a host of other issues like toxic exposures from contact to the screens and chemicals in manufacture that are actually flame retardants, structural brain changes, and as an example of the impacts from the radiation, behavioral problems in children with higher prenatal and postnatal cell phone radiation exposures. That's just one of the effects associated with cell phone exposure in young children. Here's an example of a study that has made headline news yesterday, published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, very, very prestigious journal, finding associations between screen use and changes in the brain. Really an impact to the white matter, which helps the connections happen in our brains. And this is a study that looked at children from 3 to 5 years old. They did cognitive testing, and then they did a type of MRI, and they looked at how much screen use the children had. And they found an association between the increased screen use, screen-based media use, and the integrity of the white matter of the brain. So in older children, there have been so much research, and I have to do a webinar just on the health risks of screens, which this is not. This is just focusing on the radiation impacts, but there's research that finds impacts to the neck and physical issues, ergonomic issues in the way we sit and interact with the screens that aren't healthy for our bodies and spine. Addiction, symptoms of addiction that are similar to addiction to drugs that we're seeing in kids and their cell phones. Increased suicidal thoughts, depression, impacts to sleep, cyberbullying. And then, as an example of the impact to teenagers from cell phone use, there was a study replicated that looked at memory and teenagers and cell phone use and found that teens who held the phone up to their head for 1 year had more memory damage. And the memory damage type of tests they did were to test actually that part of the brain where the phone was closest to. And they found an association, and that was a replicated study on hundreds of children actually in Switzerland. Whereas in Belgium, they have banned the sale of phones for young children under 7. They also ban advertising cell phones to young children in this age as well. So does France, by the way, and French Polynesia. They also have, and I'm using Belgium as an example because there's so many examples of this in countries not in the US. They have quite pages and pages and web pages and documents on how to reduce exposure. And while they don't, while the Belgian government doesn't say it is proven, well, there are many scientists that say, yes, it is proven, but As an example, the Belgian government says, I'm just reading to you what their federal health agency says in one of their documents on children. The use of the mobile phone by children is a special point of attention. Children may be more sensitive to radio waves. Children absorb twice as much radiation in the brain than adults do, and 10 times more in the bone marrow of the skull. And they're referring to research that looked at children's exposure proportionate to adult exposure. So same cell phone, what is the percentage of the brain and the skull and of the different tissues that are affected? In addition, due to the popularity of the mobile phone, the cumulative exposure of the current generation of children will be much higher by the time they reach their adulthood than that of current adults. So this sort of summarizes what I'm going to be going into detail about today, because they have higher doses, you could say, deeper into their brains. They also are going to have longer exposures than us as adults. You know, I got my first cell phone actually when I was pregnant with my first child for safety about 18 years ago. And I had, you know, over 30 years of no cell phone in close proximity to my body, and didn't really start using the cell phone heavily until about a decade later. Then I learned about this issue, and I have changed my ways, which I'm going to talk about more. So in comparison, in the United States, here is a screen save of what the US FDA says about cell phones in children. They say the scientific evidence does not show a danger to any users of cell phones from RF exposures, including children and teenagers. That sounds very reassuring. It doesn't make me think there could possibly be any problem, actually. The steps adults can take apply to children and teenagers as well, and then they give 2 tips: to reduce your time and to use a speaker mode to keep the phone away. And then they go into reasons, sort of talking at length about how there really isn't any scientific evidence. However, there is scientific evidence, and I'm going to talk about some of that today. And just as another example of how different countries are doing different things, this is sort of a chart with different countries and what different countries are doing related to cell phone radiation and electromagnetic fields in children. There are countries that limit the amount of magnetic field, electromagnetic radiation near homes and schools, new homes and schools. There are over 20 countries that say very clearly children should reduce exposure to cell phone radiation because they're more vulnerable. They have cell tower limits that are lower than ICNIRP or FCC limits. They have bans on mobile phones to children, which I talked about. And all of this is actually on our website on ehtrust.org. We have a section on policy. You can go to each country. You can see their videos, their infographics, all about how they are taking steps to reduce exposure. Much more needs to be done in Belgium and in France, which I'm going to talk about more. Much more needs to be done that is being done. But I can say that the United States really needs to catch up. And here is an example of an advertisement from Verizon introducing Just Kids, add it to your family's plan. Children are heavily marketed. Here is an Octopus smartwatch for children. And here is an advertising for educational video that can go on your iPhone, obviously for your very young child. So what are we talking about when we talk about wireless and electromagnetic radiation? And what is it even? All wireless devices emit electromagnetic, a type of a frequency from electromagnetic radiation. And what I'm showing you here is the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. It's divided into ionizing and non-ionizing. And these are energized waves that invisibly move through the air. They connect your phone to the cell tower. There are the same types of frequencies are used in microwaves as in Wi-Fi. And just to give you an example, you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it, although some people can. Be another webinar. The cycles of these energized waves are really fast. So radio frequency, which is the type of electromagnetic radiation that is emitted by phones and wireless, there is a range from 3 kilohertz, which is 3,000 cycles a second, to 300 gigahertz, which is 300,000 million cycles a second. Now in 5G, which is the 5th generation, and you can watch my other talks about 5G, they are going to be introducing new higher frequencies going up to millimeter waves, actually terahertz for 7G. The FCC has already talked about and I think held those for future use. So right now, different telephone companies are using different frequencies for 5G. And 5G is going to be using 4G. And I'm getting into all of these Gs. So much is to say there will be a mix of frequencies that will be emitted from all the wireless devices that are in use and will be in use with 5th generation. Now, I'm going to show you and actually play a video where engineer Claudio Fernandez from the Brazilian University is actually going to be talking about his research. And what you see is studies he did looking at, and his team did, looking at the cell phone radiation and the absorption rate into a child and into an adult. And as he is going to talk about, this is actually a slice of the brain. It's a computer modeling that takes many hours to put together. And this is published research, which came out in 2015, and also actually later, there's another study on this that came out in 2018, which I'm going to talk about. And he's going to talk about what the different colors mean. And I want to point out that something that he says that's very important is that this is slowed down. This is an animation slowed down, and it's images that are slowed down so that we can see it better. Because when frequencies are moving millions of times a second, we wouldn't be able to see it. So this is slowed down so that we can actually see it.
Children are proportionally more exposed to cell phone radiation than adults. This is the electrical field at 900 megahertz with 2 human models. One is a 34-year-old male, and the other is a 6-year-old child. This imaging shows how the field penetrates the skull and the brain. The colors represent the intensity of the field from white to yellow, orange, red, purple, and black. The animation is from slices put together and slowed down by 5 billion times. I am an electrical engineer professor, and this is a simulation using microwave industry standard software used to assess exposure to cell phone radiation.
And there are many studies. We have a web page on scientific imaging of cell phone radiation where you can see more of these kind of imaging studies that have looked at the comparison between adult and children, and also just looked at, if you have a phone with certain frequency, how much, at the worst case scenario, how does the radiation interact with brain tissue? And unfortunately, our federal standards do not account for children's unique vulnerability, not the way that the radiation is going to be absorbed deeper into their brain, but also in terms of the fact that children's bodies are developing. So even if the radiation levels were similarly experienced between an adult and a child, because the brain is still developing, early insults will have greater effects both at the time of exposure and later down the road, generally, as a general rule for environmental impacts. So this was a study published by Fernandez's team in 2018. It's imaging from the study, finding that younger models, of course, absorb more, the eyes 2 to 5-fold higher, and up to 30-fold greater in the hippocampus in the younger models. And this study also looked at virtual reality, where phones are placed in these cardboard apparatuses, which are then held up to the eyes. They simulated that as well. So our FCC limits are outdated. They were set in 1996, and they were based on studies and standards that were developed years earlier. The Environmental Protection Agency was in process of developing federally developed safety limits. They were defunded from doing so, and then the FCC adopted these limits based on industry groups' recommendations, actually combined groups' recommendations. And they did not have information on what are the impacts to children. They didn't look at what would the long-term effects be to humans, especially to children. And the EPA has since written letters. There's been much on this from our federal agencies, that these limits do not protect against non-heating effects. They only protect against heating effects, because wireless radio frequency are microwaves, and obviously we don't want to heat our brain. So they are meant to protect only from heating, not from biological effects, of which the literature at this point is so rich with studies that have found biological effects at very, very low levels. I'm not talking about 10 times lower than FCC limits. I'm talking about 100, 1,000, hundreds of thousands times lower than FCC limits. And they also weren't based on considering pregnant women and the developing babies. That was not, that information, it was not a part of the standards that the FCC adopted. And yet here we are with devices like this swipe and feed, which is a plastic thing. It's this plastic thing where you put the bottle in, and then you put the phone in it, and you can feed your baby, and you can text at the same time. I suppose you also can watch videos. But what's not been looked at is what's the impact to the baby. The radiation right there is, if you see where the phone is, can be exposing the baby's abdomen, head, chest, not to mention the mother as well. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics has issued several letters recommending action at the federal level. And we have all of these on our website under American Academy of Pediatrics. We have their I think 4 letters now that they've written, as well as their recommendations on cell phones, as well as what they say about cell towers. And here's an example of a letter they wrote saying the FCC has not reviewed the standard since 1996. There are limits based only on heat. And concerns have been raised that radio frequency affects the brain and may be connected to brain cancer. And they talk about children's more proportionately higher exposure. And they say that FCC limits need to be updated to protect children and pregnant women. Now, the World Health Organization, International Agency for the Research on Cancer, classified cell phone radiation, wireless radiation, cell tower radiation, any kind of wireless radio frequency as a Class 2B possible carcinogen in 2011, which is at this point almost a decade ago. Since then, There have been so many studies of which you can go online and watch many of our scientists presenting these studies, that the conclusion of many scientists is that the classification of possible is no longer adequate, that the scientific evidence has grown so much that the classification should be human carcinogen. And here's an example of Dr. Miller, Lloyd Morgan, Dr. Udasin, and Dr. Davis's analysis of the research, where they concluded it's a human carcinogen. As well as, I would point out, Dr. Hardell has written extensively on this as well. And here is another paper that's a nice review and summary paper published in Frontiers in Public Health, Risk to Health and Well-Being from Radio Frequency Radiation Emitted by Cell Phones and Other Wireless Devices. And that summarizes the issue of children's vulnerability, as well as some of the latest science. So when we think about how are children exposed, we can think about it like we think about smoking. There's firsthand, secondhand, and thirdhand exposures. Firsthand from the device, the user touching their body, right? Just like smoking a cigarette, the smoker is going to get the most intense exposure. Secondhand is when you're near a smoker. This is, of course, a serious issue with kids whose parents smoke. As well, here's an example in the image of an adult using a wireless device and the children nearby. And they are then being exposed to the emissions from the device. And then there are the third-hand exposures, like from the cell antennas, as well as the wireless access points, the Wi-Fi routers that might be in a room in schools, which is much lower level, but is still an exposure. And you know, the important thing is that, I'm not talking about this today, but there is an extensive body of research showing effects at levels that are very low, and also research showing that it's not just the more exposure, the more risk. There is a body of research that shows that the more exposure, the higher the risk, like from how long you hold the phone to your head. However, there's also research that shows even at low levels, there's not necessarily a dose response, but rather windows where, meaning once you get to a certain level, even a low dose can have an effect. And this was brought out in the National Toxicology peer review. You think about lead exposure, the toxic metal lead. We don't have a safe level of lead because it damages the brain, so you want to reduce it as much as possible to 0 would be safe. And similarly with wireless and cell phones, we have not identified a safe level. So scientists recommend as low as reasonably, achievable. And there's a lot we can do. People don't realize, and here's another imaging done by the Claudio Fernandez, just showing, this is a model of the head of a 6-year-old child, and just showing how that radiation is moving on the exterior. This is showing the intensities to the head and the neck, and you can see that although we can't see it when we use a phone, there are exposures happening. Same with a tablet. This is a study that looked at a 6-year-old with the tablet at about 6 inches from the head, and it looked at where is the highest rate of absorption, how are these waves interacting and penetrating, being absorbed, the rate of absorption into the child. And you can see that there is exposure even at 6 inches. And this is all on our webpage on scientific publications by Environmental Health Trust. You can find this study. And whereas when I went on Verizon, on their website, here's what I found. As an advertising for their products. parent your best with a little help from our best. And here's a picture of very young children with a device very close to their eyes. I don't even have time to talk about what I'm about to tell you, but there's also issues about blue light. We're going to do a whole webinar on blue light. And here you have children, obviously in the dark, looking at a screen with blue light. Then there's the issue of using screens in the dark, which there have been doctor reports that when you, in the middle of the night, you're looking at your phone, there are no other lights on, that actually blindness in some eyes have been reported. And you've got to have a background light on whenever you use a screen. We also have to address the blue light in screens, especially for children whose eyes are more vulnerable to radio frequency radiation and to blue light, actually. So here is another imaging, and this is, just going to show you, this is also on our YouTube channel, and this is from published research showing the waves off of the tablet, and then they do, and you can see the different colors into the head, which I'm going to show in a minute, and they're showing the absorption rate into the electric field into the tissues of the head of the child. So if that tablet is wireless, there is a wireless radiation, non-ionizing radiation, which is being emitted from it and which is being received by our bodies and by the bodies of children. And here is just another one of the devices being sold to children and to parents to buy for their children. This is an iPad potty activity seat. I actually have one. I bought it to use to show people the insanity of what is happening, and this is not okay. Now, we know that these screens are addictive, and if I had this when my kids were young, I can assure you, they would be running to use the potty, but that's not healthy. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And we also need to know what we're doing before we do it. So I wanted to make sure I talked about pregnant women and exposures, because children are more vulnerable, but pregnancy is the time of most vulnerability. Many pregnant women take the phone and they use it resting on their abdomen because it's just logical. It's like a shelf, right? So babySafeProject.org, please visit that. It is an appeal by over 200, actually I think they're signed on to now by over 250. Doctors, scientists, public health experts with recommendations on reducing exposure during pregnancy. And they have a wonderful pamphlet. They have materials. They have a video featuring Dr. Hugh Taylor, who's chief of obstetrics at Yale, talking about his research, which found that mice exposed to cell phone radiation had poor memory, more hyperactivity, and he recommends keeping the phone away from the abdomen.
The fetus is perhaps the most vulnerable to these types of insults. When the brain is just forming, we are perhaps at our most vulnerable stage. So this is a study that really looked at only the effect of prenatal exposure to cell phone radiation. What effect does having a cell phone near your baby when you're pregnant have on that baby later on in life when that baby's grown up? We tested these mice when they reached adulthood and looked at the lasting effect of that early prenatal cell phone exposure. The mice who were exposed to cell phones were more hyperactive. They were running around the cage a lot more aggressively. They had poorer memory. They couldn't remember objects in the cage as well as their counterparts who weren't exposed to the cell phone radiation. But they did not have any increased anxiety, as sometimes running around can be a sign of anxiety. It was not that. They were calm and relaxed. So they were running around these cages, bouncing off the walls, not a care in the world. Something that, in our eyes, resembles attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in children. that was the closest model we can think of to the behavioral effects that we saw in the mice.
When I first saw Hugh Taylor's study, I was thrilled and really deeply concerned, because I was aware of research earlier looking at what happens inside the brain. And if you look at something called the dentate gyrus, which occurs here and is quite critical to where brain cells form for thinking and learning, you can see that prenatally exposed rats develop smaller brains with more brain damage.
The brain is tremendously resilient, but when there's so many environmental insults at once, the circuitry in the brain becomes overwhelmed. And unlike what we have in our electrical wiring in homes, where there's a circuit breaker that can stop the electrical flow before it causes damage, the brain doesn't have that same capacity. And so environmental insults, when they add up, the circuitry is especially vulnerable.
We have some human evidence now where a few studies have followed women with exposures to electromagnetic fields, and they have seen that their children who were exposed to more electromagnetic radiation tend to have more learning disabilities and more problems in school.
Mothers who spent a lot of time on the cell phone, carried a cell phone with them during their pregnancies, had a higher risk of having children with behavioral problems. And I think when you have clear cause and effect relationship in mice, and an association in women, that women who use these cell phones had children with more behavioral problems, I think that's together very powerful evidence saying that this is truly a cause and effect in humans as well. The mouse studies prove that it's really causative, that the cell phones are causing it. It's not just because of some other behaviors linked to cell phones in women.
And I'm just going to read a few of the recommendations that they have. Avoid carrying the phone on your body. Avoid holding any wireless device against your body when it's in use. Use your cell phone on speaker setting or with an air tube headset. Avoid using your wireless device in cars, trains, or elevators because the radiation reflects is inside a metal, actually, and also in traveling vehicles, the radiation can be higher. When using Wi-Fi, connect only to download, then disconnect, or would recommend using wired connections, which are of course safe. And they talk about sleeping away from wireless utility meters. We recommend getting an analog utility meter, and if you can't, then laws need to be changed so that you can, because smart meters emit radio frequency. Now, the Baby Safe project is based on research that found impacts to brain development during the prenatal time. And this is just one of many studies, in addition to the Yale Medicine study that I mentioned, where mice had, if they could have ADHD, that's what they had, says Dr. Hugh Taylor, who you can watch his video online. But in addition, there's research from different parts of the world where they have exposed small animals to cell phone radiation and found changes in the brain, damaged brain cells. So this is showing fewer cells in the hippocampus, in a region of the hippocampus. After cell phone radiation, we have all of this on our website under brain development. And other effects, both to children, pregnant women, in animals, in humans, that have been found are listed by the EMF scientist in an appeal that went out in 2015. And I'm just going to quote from the EMF appeal. Numerous recent scientific publications have shown that EMFs affects living organisms at levels well below international and national guidelines. And the effects are increased cancer, cellular stress, increase in harmful free radicals, genetic damage, changes of the reproductive system, learning and memory, neurological disorders, and negative impacts on well-being. And there are actually many appeals that have gone out by doctors and scientists worldwide. I want to mention the fine print warnings because children are using phones and laptops and wireless devices, and parents are unaware of the fine print warnings that are in these devices. So in your phone, it says that it's to remain compliant with FCC limits, there needs to be a distance between the phone and your body, and it'll list that distance. So the iPhone 4 says carry it at least 10 millimeters away from your body. The newest iPhones actually are at 5 millimeters, which seems, oh, that's so small. How can that impact us if I keep it at a distance to my body? But actually, when it's closer than that, when phones are closer than the distance that they state, because that's the distance they test the phone at for radiation emissions, there have been many measurement studies done on phones and found the majority of them can exceed limits when they are closer. My laptop says 8 inches, it says 20 centimeters. The cordless phone says the base will say about 20 centimeters generally. Baby monitors also 20 centimeters, that base of the baby monitor that the parent might have. So just want to see if anyone has put any questions in the Q&A. Please put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will be answering questions. What's the big takeaway from the Chicago Tribune cell phone study? The takeaway is that when the journalists took the phones to an FCC certified lab, they found that two important things. One, the SAR, the radiation, the value, how do we say this? The specific absorption rate, which is a measurement of the cell phone radiation absorbed into the body, was not what the manufacturers reported. That was one. It was much higher in many cases, not all. The second thing is that when the phone was tested in body contact, or actually not in body contact, they did it at 2 millimeters, which is still, like they said, as much as if the phone was in your pants pocket. And when they did that testing, they found that the phone actually had SAR rates which exceeded FCC limits, several of the phone models that they tested. So this is just so important because we have a limit in the United States. The FCC has a limit. And phones are exceeding those limits at body contact, or in close proximity to the body. So why isn't the FCC, the FDA, why isn't anyone doing anything about that?
Radiation from cell phones has been a controversial issue since cell phones first hit the market. The phones use radio waves to communicate, and those radio waves are a form of electromagnetic radiation. We're not talking about ionizing radiation, such as gamma rays and X-rays. Exposure to that kind of radiation can cause serious harm. Cell phone radiation isn't that powerful. But back in the 1990s, the federal government was concerned enough to set a safety limit. It's measured in the amount of radiation from the phone that is absorbed in human tissue. To this day, a new phone model can't be brought to market unless testing shows that it meets the standard. Still, we at the Chicago Tribune wondered, how much radiation exposure do phones really cause? We bought more than a dozen phones and had them tested by an accredited lab using standard procedures. To test each one, the lab owner used a special mixture of fluids that mimics the electrical properties of the body. He poured that into a fiberglass tub. Then he secured a phone underneath the tub and set it to operate at full power. A robotic arm dipped up and down in the fluid, measuring the amount of radiation it was absorbing. There were two main things we wanted to know. First, would the phones meet the safety limit if tested at the same distance from the body as the manufacturer's own testing? It turned out that some phones exceeded the limit. Next, we noticed that federal rules allow phone manufacturers to test phones up to 25 millimeters away from a simulated body. That's nearly an inch. The rules reflect times when many people carried their phones in belt clips or even holsters, not that close to the body. So our second question was, what if phones were tested at a smaller distance to reflect how people carry their phones today, like in a pocket? This is crucial. Typically, the farther away a phone is away from simulated tissue, the less exposure to radiation. So we move the phones in closer to 2 millimeters, or less than 1/10 of an inch. At this distance, radiation exposure often exceeded the safety standard. Does this radiation cause harm? Some scientists think there's not much to worry about. They say if phones were such a big hazard, we'd see people getting sick. Others aren't so sure. They think harm may only appear after years and years of use. So does this mean you should throw your cell phone away? No. But our investigation does raise questions about the way cell phones are regulated and the exposure some consumers may be experiencing. 2 major cell phone manufacturers disputed our methods and told us their phones meet all safety standards. But the Federal Communications Commission, after learning of our testing, says it's going to follow up with tests of its own. If you're concerned about radiation, consider these steps. Still got a landline? Probably should use it, especially for really long calls. When making calls, put your cell phone on a speakerphone. And finally, avoid carrying phones next to your skin or in your shirt or pants pocket.
So a growing number of prominent doctors and scientists are raising warning flags over radiation this morning, and your kids could be facing a greater risk of exposure. NBC national correspondent Miguel Almaguer was granted rare access inside a cell phone test lab.
You see them every day, everywhere. Kids on phones. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, children are now exposed to an exponentially greater amount of radio frequency than any adult will ever be in a lifetime. Part of the problem, this isn't your mother's flip phone. Smartphones today have multiple antennas located inside the phone. When you talk, text, stream music, or videos, they emit non-iodizing radiation, similar to a low-powered microwave oven.
And it's the irregular, pulsed nature of the signal over thousands of minutes, over many years, that we believe can cause a great problem for children and for the rest of us as well.
Cell phone providers say they follow all safety guidelines put into place by the FCC. Those cell phone companies then work with labs like this one to test your device. The current FCC safety standard was developed nearly 20 years ago. The test at Sedicom in Milpitas, California, starts by taping a phone to the ear of a plastic head. The size of a 200-pound man, it's filled with liquid. The fluids used in these tests best replicate the same properties inside the human head. Scientists are then able to determine how much radiation penetrates the head when you're talking on the phone. The robotic arm precisely moves to various hotspots on the head to test the specific absorption rate. The phone we tested was within the FCC allowed radiation limit, but critics say these standards are outdated and urge the federal agency to adopt stricter radiation guidelines. Current FCC standards do not account for the unique vulnerability and use patterns specific to pregnant women and children, warns the American Academy of Pediatrics in a letter to the FCC.
Children are not little adults. The skull is thinner. Also, the volume of the brain is less compared to 200-plus size man.
The U.S. Government Accountability Office also asked the FCC to reassess the exposure limit, in particular the radiation limit when you have your cell phone close to your body, like in your pocket or when you hold it directly next to your head, or as some teens do, sleep with it on their pillow.
Phones are transmitting radiation so long as they're connected to the internet and connected to the Wi-Fi. And even if you're not talking on your phone is talking to the tower.
Critics of the FCC's current guidelines give this simple advice to all consumers. Use the speakerphone or an earpiece, and remember, distance is your friend. Keeping a phone even a few inches off your body reduces exposure several thousand times. For today, Miguel Almaguer, NBC News, Milpitas, California.
Health agencies from other countries, including Canada, Israel, and France, recommend limiting a child's exposure to cell phone radiation. The FCC tells NBC News, quote, "The U.S. has among the most conservative standards in the world. As part of our routine review of these standards, we're soliciting input from multiple stakeholder experts, including federal health agencies and others, to guide our assessment." Makes you think twice as a parent, though,
Absolutely.
especially one whose kids are on the cell phone a lot.
Yeah, when you think about that, they're particularly vulnerable. This is all such new technology. I think we have yet to really see the effects. We've got more info, by the way, on today.com.
While parents who have a busy day, parents who have a busy day are not aware of this issue and they're handing phones to kids. And then, as Christine says, thank you, why isn't an industry doing anything about this? And I have to say, industry is going to say, hey, we're following all the rules. We're following all the federal regulations. So we really need to have pressure on both industry, but really on our government to do its job. Because our federal agencies have a duty to protect us at every level of government. And the ball has been absolutely dropped and everyone's pointing the finger in other directions. The FCC says, well, we're not a health and safety agency. The industry says we're just following the rules. So there are several things happening. There are lawsuits moving forward, which is a piece of the puzzle because there are, I think now it's over 13 cases of people with brain tumors they developed on the side of the head where the phone was held. And those cases are moving forward. There are actions happening in different parts of the country. And like in Berkeley, for example, the Cell Phone Right to Know Act, which was passed and immediately slapped with a lawsuit by the wireless industry. The wireless industry says, well, you can't force us to say something we don't want to say. There are actually proclamations in other parts of the country where elected officials have issued proclamations informing people that phones emit radiation. So Christine asked a question. Many expert heavyweights have been pushing for SAR guidelines to be updated. They're around 30 years old, yes. What do you think about advancements being made in this regard? So actually, it's not just that SAR guidelines need to be outdated. It's that the SAR test itself is absolutely inadequate to protect us. So, oh, hello. So the SAR test, which is where they have a plastic head or a plastic body phantom or like a plastic tub that represents the body, is a way that phones are pre-market tested for safety. And there is a level, and it is based on heat, at which if the phones exceed, then they have to be fixed so that they emit less radiation so that the level is lower. There has to be an update to our FCC limits so that we use modeling which better represents human tissue. And actually the current SAR tests are completely irrelevant in terms of biological effects. I'm going to see if I can get this back up. I wanted to show you a few things. Yes, here's a question. If you could reach all those considering giving smart wireless gifts this upcoming holiday season, what would be your main message they might want to consider? And that is that it's hard to get one message, but cell phones and wireless were never pre-market safety tested. And the instructions say that it shouldn't be near the body. Research shows harm at very low levels, levels that are legally allowed. Brain damage, damage to memory, sleep damage, increased cancer, tumor promotion, the potentiation of effects from known carcinogens. So there's research where if you take a cell phone radiation and combine it with another known carcinogen that we know causes tumors in experimental studies on animals, that then the effect of that carcinogen is greater in the animals that had the combined exposure of the radio frequency radiation in addition to the carcinogen. So it potentiates effects, and we're exposed to wireless from we're exposed to cancer-causing chemicals and exposures all the time, right? So having something that makes that worse is really a bad idea. And actually, we're going to do a whole section on, which I'm really excited about, on holiday gifts. Every year we try to come out with recommendations for gifts that are not wireless for parents. I'm trying to get this out. I wanted to show you what, just a video. I actually showed this at the National Toxicology Program peer review, where we had 3 minutes to speak when the National Toxicology Program findings on cell phone radiation were being deliberated on. And this is just easily found on YouTube, kids using wireless devices. And I'm not just talking about cell phones.
Like a diamond in the sky, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what.
So we have this beautiful child who's singing and holding that device near her body, except all of these virtual assistants actually have fine print warnings that they should not be held near the body. And to have here the warning for the Amazon Echo instructions, which are in the manufacturer's set of safety information. It's online on Amazon. And it says it should be operated with a minimum distance of 20 centimeters between the radiator and your body. And it is advised that they use the product in a manner that minimizes the potential for contact during human operation. And, people don't know, parents don't know. Industry is not providing this information. And when people try to provide the information to their constituents, like in Berkeley or San Francisco, they are slammed with a court case, with a lawsuit, saying they can't inform them at point of sale. Here's a child with it on her lap. Now this is just moving forward to the next one. So. I should also say, I don't know if you've heard the news, that the French government, several ministries have issued a joint press release, this just happened, calling for phones to be tested at body contact. And this happened after the French health agency, kind of like the French FDA, actually issued a report saying, we tested hundreds of phones. The majority of them exceeded limits, the regulatory limits at body contact. Phones should be tested at body contact. And in the meantime, we have to educate consumers about the fact that they should, to use the phones at a distance to decrease exposure. So that is all happening now. So now I see another comment here, whoops. Someone just said, so many people encourage children to use their personal assistants to help with homework. I know. And here is an example of an incredible piece of technology that could be hardwired. Why can't these virtual assistants be hardwired? Now, I'm not saying that that's good for kids' homework, actually. That's a separate conversation. But it could be hardwired. You can't even buy it hardwired. When I buy speakers for the computers in my family, I have to go to used stores, secondhand stores, which is fine. I like to do that because it's less trash in the environment. But you can't even go to the store and buy a speaker that's not wireless. And that's a problem. You'd have to go online and order it special at this point. I haven't found any in our local stores. So we really need to be, as consumers, asking for safe technology. This is one component. There's getting our federal government accountable and keeping them in the hot seat on this, raising the issue at every level of government, talking to companies about two things. One is what we want, because, you know, we want safe technology and they need to do the research and design to create that, make that available, and also holding them accountable for the damage from the harm from their products. So great, please put more in the chat. I'm reading your messages. Someone said, so many encourage children to use their personal assistant devices to help with homework, which is sad. And how do you find laptops? It's really hard to find laptops with Ethernet ports. This is another issue, and I'm just kind of coming into this with, I'm going to show you imaging, which is also done by Claudio Fernandez and his team in Brazil. And this is the Wi-Fi radiation, the electric field from a laptop on a lap. And it shows the way the field moves, propagates in the air off the laptop. And then also there's going to be a different image which shows it, how there is, the field is in the body. And I'm going to actually have you listen to him talk about this as well.
I am an electrical engineer professor, and this is a simulation using microwave industry standard software used to assess exposure to wireless devices such as cell phones, tablets, and in this case, a wireless laptop at 2.45 gigahertz when the Wi-Fi of the laptop is on and the laptop is on your lap. This imaging show how the field penetrates the body. The colors represents the intensity of the field from white to yellow, orange, red, purple, and black. This is a high resolution simulation, and it took 2 days to run in a Tesla GPU. And we can show the results in different views and different slices.
So this is a very sophisticated computer program that shows a simulation of how Wi-Fi, the field from wireless radiation, and how it is absorbed into the body. And I don't think that parents are aware. I know I was absolutely not aware of this before I knew about it. And we really have a right to know about this. So imagine a child with a laptop on the lap, or I see a lot of teenagers, they lie down and then the laptop goes right on the chest. And here is an image from, this is actually a video from the Baltimore County Public Schools that has a one-on-one device program, and they are promoting their program, and they have children with these devices on their laps. Look how their arms are small, their hands are small. The entire laptop is right there, exposing their abdomen, their chest, their reproductive parts to wireless radiation. And I don't believe that the school system or certainly the administrators at first were aware of this. Now I hope they are, because there have been many parents raising this issue there in Baltimore, as well as Montgomery County and a lot of areas in Maryland. So, and someone just wrote in, there's so much normalization and glamorization from, I don't know what that means, from on the advertising from wireless companies. It's hard to find one that doesn't feature a cell phone. I know, and it's really scary because it's you know, I think a decade ago, we never thought, who would have thought that children would be using cell phones? I remember when cell phones first came out, they were for emergencies. They were for people with extremely or important jobs, lawyers, and you never thought your kid would have one. You thought, well, when they go to college. Now 10 years old is the norm for a cell phone. I think that the age might even be lower than that now. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics has come out with recommendations on how to reduce exposure to cell phone radiation. And they are: use text when possible, use the phone in speaker mode or with the use of a hands-free kit. They say when talking on the cell phone, try holding it an inch or more away from your head. Now, we don't believe that is protective, but it's certainly better. This would be the opinion, my opinion. It's certainly better than pressing the phone to your head, but actually an inch away, we need to get some stronger recommendations, but I'm glad that they are saying this. Make only short or essential calls on cell phones. Avoid carrying your phone against the body like in a pocket sock or bra. Cell phone manufacturers can't guarantee the amount of radiation you're being exposed to. I don't know why that's clipped off. If you plan to watch a movie on your device, download it first, then switch to airplane mode while you watch in order to avoid unnecessary radiation exposure. This is extremely important. I want to point this particular line out because you think about in schools, all the kids on devices where the teacher says, watch this video, and they're all streaming videos at the same time. That is against what the American Academy of Pediatrics says right here, which is have it downloaded, have the device on airplane mode to avoid unnecessary radiation exposure. And I think it's really important to raise this with schools and with your fellow parents. Now, someone, actually I'm going to answer this after. Keep an eye on your signal strength. The weaker your cell phone signal, the harder your phone works and the more radiation it gives off. It's best to wait until you have a stronger signal before using your device. So when the signal is poor, like in my house right now, I have a very, very weak signal. It's one of the reasons I chose my house. But when you use a cell phone in the house, the phone, and this is backed by research by the California Department of Public Health. They have published, it's Walls research showing your phone can emit up to 10,000 times more radiation in an area of low signal, which could be, say, in the basement. Maybe outside you have good signal, but when you're inside, the signal is low. Now, also in elevators, in cars in rural areas, your phone is working harder to reach that cell tower. This does not mean we need more cell towers though, because when you have more cell towers and a really strong signal, then we end up with full body exposure to all over involuntary, or not even on the phone, and we're getting higher exposures than you would if you're in an area of low signal. So, the AAP also talks about avoid making calls in cars, elevators, trains, and buses because the phone works harder. What happens in a car is that a couple things. First, as you travel through space, your phone is connecting, even if you're not on it, the phone is connecting with every new tower that you pass and saying, hello, how are you? I'm here. And then the cell tower says hi, and they sort of make this digital handshake. And those are peaks of radiation that you're being exposed to in the car. And if you were just in one place, it wouldn't be having all these check-ins with the new towers. It's still checking in actually regularly, but not having those changeovers with new cell towers. Plus, when you're in a car, it's metal, and the radiation can reflect and bounce around in the car in ways that are not, it's different for every situation. And you can have an increased exposure in a car. So someone asked a question just now. Any suggestions on how to inform parents in public when we see them hand devices to children, or should be? It's so hard to stand by and say nothing. I know. That is one reason we developed, sometimes I go up to parents and I say, I wonder if you know a little something about your phone that it emits radiation. I might have a safety card. Actually, I don't have one right here. I should have brought one. We made Environmental Health Trust has cards that we can hand out. We have business side cards you can print out that can go in your wallet, and you can just hand them to someone. Every situation is different, and I know as a parent, the last thing I want is anyone telling me what to do with my child. But I kind of wish someone had come up to me and told me. So I do it very, I might just say, hey, here's a little something, and I'll just walk away. If they want to come up to me and talk more, that's fine. Some people I don't do, and sometimes it's absolutely, just not the right thing to do. But sometimes I have found many people say, thank you. I didn't know that. So I think you have to sort of figure out what makes the most sense in every situation. I was thinking about a pin, having a pin made that I can wear that says, ask me about cell phone radiation, and just putting it on and just saying, if you're interested, I'm glad to tell you about this issue. Someone just said, with people traveling this holiday season, let's talk about Wi-Fi routers on board planes and airport scanners, which emit millimeter waves, and increased frequencies inside planes and buses and trains. And this is a real issue, and it's kind of unavoidable at certain levels. So the scanners, when you are going in the airport and you're about to fly on a plane, those scanners are generally millimeter waves. I do the pat down. If you do a pat down, you need to go there early. Go there really early, because sometimes it takes a long time. You have to walk up and say, I would like the pat down, not to go into that device. And I do recommend that. It's just one way to minimize that exposure. And when you're in public transport, you're being exposed to everyone all around you. And this is a really important issue. It's why we need policy change. It's why governments have to take some responsibility and fix this problem that has been created by just passing the buck. No one's really in charge. There is no agency. There is absolutely zero health and safety agency in charge of the permissible levels from the wireless antennas, the maximum permissible exposure levels, it's called, that the FCC has adopted as well. There is no one in charge of systematically reviewing the science, issuing reports. I mean, don't you think that we should have like a bunch of really smart scientists who every year are looking at all the science, issuing a report saying, we think these levels are protective, and here's why, here's the science we looked at. They have each study they looked at, they say what they think about each one. Where is that? It doesn't exist in the United States. I thought it did before I got interested in this. And when I learned that no one was doing that, I was just in shock. But it's the reality. I mean, if cell phones and wireless were a drug, they would be banned. They would never be able to come to market. But we didn't do pre-market testing, and we're not doing post-market surveillance, meaning if there are problems that are reported, there's no database where this is all being compiled into data and information that policymakers can use to understand what's even going on. That's not even happening. Whereas in other countries, and here's an example, this is an image from the French Polynesia Public Information Campaign, where they actually have this short, incredible 1-minute video on all the things that emit radiation in the home. And then they have this quite detailed, I must say, brochure in several languages on how to reduce exposure to all of these sources of electromagnetic radiation. So here is a screen save from one of the videos. And I just wanted to sort of launch into learn what emits radiation in your home. So they have the Wi-Fi router, they have the gaming console, which is so important to know that wireless gaming consoles emit radio frequency radiation. The handheld device does, as well as the console, the other end of it. And those can emit all the time, even when you're not using them. Many parents are not aware of that. And then of course there's the phone to the head. They also show a kitchen and how appliances give off magnetic fields. So go to our international policy page and you can see more about that. Ask me more questions, please put it in the chat. I am interested to hear your questions so that I can answer them and make this presentation clear for people who are listening in. So here are some other things that we can do. At home, get a corded landline like this. This is mine. It has a connection between the handset and the base. And I do my voice calls and as much as I can by corded phone. As the AAP says, avoid making calls in cars, elevators, trains, and buses. And this has been really hard for me because I used to really always talk to my friends in the car. As a busy mom, that's when I took my calls. I would drive an hour to work every day. When I worked as a therapist at an ADHD clinic, and that was my time. Wasn't with my kids. I could have all kinds of phone conversations, but I don't do that anymore, and that's actually been a little bit hard because I miss that time. But I know that the radiation emissions are higher in the car, and I don't use a cell phone in that way anymore at all, actually. Create a healthy sleep sanctuary. This is something that people can really do if you're starting out on this issue. Remove all the electronics from your child's bedroom. Remove the screens. All wireless devices. Don't forget gaming consoles and corded phones. So some people have cordless phones right by their bed. Don't sleep with your phone on. If you need an alarm clock, I'll show you mine. It's battery powered. Alarm clock works great. We also have, of course, a corded phone for emergencies. No screens at least an hour or two before bedtime. Make sure you have a covering for red light, for the blue light from the screens on all your screens as well, which we have on this device, as well as all my kids' laptops. They're teenagers, they're in school. I wish that there weren't homework that needed screens. This is like a whole other issue is schools. And I have a couple webinars on schools that are up, and I'll be doing more as well. Use wired, not Wi-Fi in your home. We have all wired internet, and I'm going to show you an Ethernet cord. So this is the Ethernet. To get it into my laptop, which does not have a plug for this, I have an adapter, and every device is different, and then this USB goes right into the laptop. And it takes a little time to get what you need for this, but it's actually simpler than it seems. And when I finally did it, I thought, oh my goodness, why didn't I do this sooner? So the first thing you can do is turn the Wi-Fi off when not in use and at night. Get the devices that you need so that you can be completely hardwired. And it's faster, safer, and more secure. Someone just wrote that so many are driving distracted. I know, by texting and even hands-free. And this is really important. The cell phone should be completely off in the car. I hope I was clear about that. Not just don't talk on them, but just have them off. We don't even, for navigating, I have a GPS kind of going old style, but it works just great. It has no wireless antennas, and I can navigate throughout DC. I live in the DC area, and I think that's really important. Now, if you have a cell phone and you're not ready to give up the navigation on it, though I do recommend going completely wired with the GPS that I'm talking about, but you can set it to go where it needs to go and turn the antennas off. Make sure you've turned off the Bluetooth as well, the hotspot, everything. So, but it will still be able to give you those directions. Someone wrote that wrote about the need for a digital detox and Dr. Victoria Dunkley's recommendations on an electronic fast. I actually have a slide on that. I think I didn't put that in for some reason, but I was just thrilled to be at the EMF conference in California and to meet Dr. Dunkley, who has a book about the impact of screens on kids and what she's seen in her practice as a psychiatrist, where kids were coming in with all these symptoms, and when they cut out the screens, that a lot of the behavioral issues decreased or actually disappeared after some electronic screen fast. And what she says that's really important is that it's not just that watch educational shows with your kids or decrease your screen time. It's that the screen actually needs to be off. The media itself is overstimulating to the brain, and that overstimulation dysregulates the child. So when there are no screens, TV away, computers away, cell phone away, then the children can, their brains can settle and they can focus on the play and the work of children, which is to play and learn and use their hands and their full body in imagine, in dreaming, and all that kids do. So someone just wrote that she actually writes prescriptions such as no laptops. That's right. And it was incredible hearing, and not just from Dr. Dunkley, she presented, as well as Tori Jetler, Dr. Jetler, who also has a protocol on calming, a calming protocol, which is all about having the screens off, reducing electromagnetic radiation. And all of these doctors shared examples of the changes that they've seen in their patients who took this leap. It seems like, what? Really everyone else is doing it, but just go for it, and seeing incredible changes in their children. Parents were seeing incredible changes in their children. And I know personally I've seen it myself, so it's so important. I talked about going corded with Ethernet connections for computers, and that would be getting an Ethernet plug like I talked about so that you can plug your computer in. I am talking to you on a wired computer, not a wireless computer. Remember, when you plug it in, and I'm actually going to do a whole webinar on like step-by-step how to plug in your laptop, how to make your, oops, there's like my other corded phone ringing in the other room. Sorry about that. How to connect, how to go through your house step by step and make changes to reduce the electromagnetic radiation. Remember, oops, sorry, I'll wait till that passes. Remember to turn the Wi-Fi antennas off in your device. Go to the antennas at the top, like in the settings of your laptop. If you have it plugged into Ethernet, you also need to turn the wireless antennas off. And another tip, that you can do starting now is when you're not connected wirelessly, work offline more and turn off the antennas. So I'm sometimes in situations like in hotel rooms when I travel for work, and I don't have a way to plug my laptop into a wired, the Ethernet. I will work offline, and I only turn on the Wi-Fi when I have to connect. I might write out all my emails and then just turn it on briefly to have those connections happen at that time, instead of having the antennas on all the time. And I've actually found that there are several hotels, if you do a little pre-planning, where you can still find that corded connection, but it's not that easy anymore. Great, well, thank you so much. Someone just wrote thanking for all these measures that they have taken. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing as well. And please ask me any more questions. If you'd like, we're going to be putting this up on Patreon. I'm hoping that will be a great introduction for people who are new to this issue. We also have a variety of videos on our YouTube channel. I did a 2-part seminar on 5G, which is just filled with everything going on. And I need to do part 3 because there was just a major protest in Rome. And I want to get video from that up and all the international policy that's happening. Back to what you can do at home. Laptops and tablets should be on a table, not on your lap, and not even if the Wi-Fi antennas are off, which they always should be when you hand a digital device to a child. But they also emit magnetic fields, a lower frequency for the power related to the power for the device, and they really should always be on a table, not on a lap. Switch to an analog meter. I talked about that. If you can't get one in your town or city, then the elected officials need to have a way that you can. And really, all meters should be analog rather than emitting radio frequency all the time because of the frequencies and what the network that they create, which is all happening invisibly in the air. And also it creates electromagnetic interference, also known as dirty electricity, which I'm going to talk about in a separate webinar and hopefully explain for you. So, so smart meters are not smart. And just a little bit about what's going on internationally. The Maryland State Children's Environmental Health and Protection Advisory Council of Maryland has issued recommendations on reducing exposure to wireless in the classroom. Now, what they say is that you should limit exposure as much as feasibly practical, and that the Maryland State Department of Education should consider using wired devices in the classroom. And this is like really important. If a new classroom is to be built, network cables can be added. So if you're going to do a new build, add cables providing wired network access so that it's in, so you don't have to retrofit. Because it's only a matter of time as more and more research comes out to where there will be that policy change that we need. And then we're going to look back at all of these schools and say, wait, we've got to put in all these wires. The governments are going to, oh, you know what? So I wanted to make sure you knew about that. That's on our website, ehtrust.org. And I'm sorry about that. I should have turned the phone off in the other room. This is our Patreon website. I thank you so much for your support. I would like to hear from you about what you're interested in. I know many of you on the call and that you know a lot about this issue. So this was meant to be a more general overview for people new. However, what I'd like to do is some really deep dives into a lot of the technical issues. And if you're interested, I want to know what they are. I want to hear from people who are new to this, what their questions are, and people who know a lot and what your questions are. Like, for example, what are the FCC limits? That's a whole conversation. And I want to explain the different limits, how they were designed and developed, what they are, how they are compared to other countries, and what the issues are with them that we need to address. So I also recommend the articles by Dr. Cindy Russell, Physicians for Safe Technology. MD Safe Tech is their website. She has 2 publications in the Santa Clara Medical Association, Shallow Minds on how the internet and Wi-Fi in schools can affect learning, and Wi-Fi in schools. Dr. Martha Herbert has an article in the Autism Notebook about electromagnetic fields and autism and ADHD. I really recommend that. Also, go to our website where we have downloadable printables for you to share with your community on reducing exposure to cell phone radiation. Different cards that on the front have like a tip and on the back have a more detailed recommendations on how to reduce exposure. We have what parents need to know about safe technology, all about everything I'm talking about now. And let's see if there you go. And please.
Did you know that cell phone, the one in your pocket, emits radio frequency radiation? As long as your phone's turned on, even if you're not talking or texting.
The American Academy of Pediatrics in over a dozen countries recommends reducing children's exposure to wireless radiation.
When using a cell phone, I always keep it away from my body. I use speakerphone or a headset like this.
To stop microwave exposure, I put my phone on airplane mode and turn off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth function.
I hold the phone at a distance and make sure it's not touching my body.
Cell phones are not toys. Children's brains and bodies are still developing and are vulnerable to wireless radiation. Practice safe and responsible habits with yourself and your children.
When using the computer, I always try to make sure my connection is corded, not wireless.
Remember not to use your cell phone in the car. The phone works at higher power in metal surroundings and bounces around, increasing your family's radiation exposure.
For their safety.
For your safety.
Because children are more vulnerable.
Remind them.
Remind yourself.
To limit your microwave radiation exposures.